Good evening. My name is Lucy Pierpont, and I'm the Marketing and Special Events Director at the Kent Memorial Library. On behalf of the House of Books and Kent Memorial Library, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this very special book talk and virtual signing with author from Cornwall, Roxana Robinson. She will be discussing the new edition of her biography, Georgia O'Keeffe, A Life. Helping us tonight is our technology point person, Amanda Myers. She has asked me to read a couple of rules for you. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, please type it in the chat and she will connect with you to troubleshoot. And we will save time at the end for Q&A. If you have a question throughout the program, please type it in the chat and we will get to it at the end of the program. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to the General Manager of House of Books, Ben Rybeck.
Thank you so very much, Lucy. Thank you all for being there. I'll keep my part of this brief and turn things back to Lucy, but I just want to quickly thank I want to thank Lucy. I want to thank the Kent Memorial Library. I want to thank Roxana Robinson, a wonderful, wonderful author and friend of the store, for doing this evening. And I want to mention that House of Books, if you don't know, is an independently owned bookstore in Kent, Connecticut, for over 40 years now. We have lots of books and virtual events and all sorts of stuff. So if you're interested in hearing more about everything that we have, including more events like this one, please visit us at houseofbooksct.com and sign up for our newsletter there. As Lucy mentioned, we will have time for questions afterward. You'll see me again then. I will pop back on here to moderate the Q&A. So please, as you have questions tonight, include them there in the chat. And of course, signed copies of the book will be available to purchase through House of Books. So please, you can place your order online for pickup at houseofbooksct.com/O'Keeffe, and we will put that over there in the chat view as well. So that's all for me for now. You'll see me again a little bit later. Turn things back over to Lucy. Thank you.
Hello, and when you are typing in houseofbooksconnecticut.com, do please spell O'Keeffe correctly. It's a tough one. It's Okeeffe. During the summer, Roxana Robinson was our guest at a book talk for her recently published book, Dawson's Fall. During her talk, she mentioned that her biography of Georgia O'Keeffe was being re-released in the fall. Then, on October 1st, there was an article in the New Yorker written by Roxana titled, How I Met the Reclusive Georgia O'Keeffe. I immediately thought, this is a subject that will interest lots of people. So I emailed Roxana and invited her to talk about her book and have a virtual signing, and here we are. When her O'Keeffe biography was first published in 1989, it received rave reviews and was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. This new edition features a new foreword by the author setting O'Keeffe in an artistic context over the last 30 years since the book was first published, as well as previously unpublished letters of the young O'Keeffe to her lover, Arthur Mcmahon. It also relates the story of Robinson's own encounter with the artist. Roxana Robinson is the author of 10 books, 6 novels, 3 collections of short stories, and the biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. 4 of these were chosen as New York Times notable books, 2 as New York Times Editor's Choices. Her fiction has appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Harper's, Best American Short Stories, Tin House, and elsewhere. Her work has been widely anthologized and broadcast on NPR. She makes her home in nearby Cornwall. I now turn to you, Roxana. Please tell us more.
Good evening. Okay, so let me turn my cell phone off. Sorry, I have a new cell phone and I don't know how to work it. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to the Kent Memorial Library and to House of Books, Ben Ryback. Writers love to feel that we are part of a local community and that we can participate in events like this and find our readers in different ways besides just the book. So I will be talking about this new edition of my biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. And a year or so ago, Sue Raymond of the Brandeis University Press wrote to me and asked me if I would be interested in republishing the book, and asked if there was any new information, any new material that I could add to it. And I was really interested by that. When I wrote the book, I didn't want the word I, the personal pronoun I, to appear in it at all. I did not want me to be a part of the book. It was only to be about O'Keeffe. So there was no foreword, there was no introduction. It was just O'Keeffe and her story. But this time, 30 years later, I thought it would be interesting to readers. I was at a conference with some other writers, and they were asking me about how this book came about, and I told them the story of how I met O'Keeffe, and one of them said, "Have you written this?" And I said, "No, it's oral history. It's never been written." And she said, "But now it's part of art history, so you should write it." And I thought, she's right. If I would want to know that about another biographer. So I've written that introduction, and sorry. Stop this. I don't know how to turn off my cell phone. So I wrote the introduction, and I was also able to include a group of letters which O'Keeffe wrote to a man called Arthur Mcmahon, who was an extremely important part of her life. So I'll start out, could I have the first slide? This is Georgia O'Keeffe in about 1915. She was 28 years old then, and she'd already been painting and studying art for 10 years or so. Let's see, she started around 1906. So yeah, 10 or 11 years. She started out by studying art at the Art Institute of Chicago, which was a famous center for art history, and they had a great museum. And it was interesting that she studied in the middle of the country, which was a place where the currents of modern art had not yet arrived. So what she was studying was sort of a 19th century approach to art. And she learned by drawing plaster casts of antique sculpture and drawing cones and cubes to learn perspective and shading. It was a very traditional kind of the study of art. And she was an extremely good student. She learned everything. And they also studied the old masters. So they studied perspective and composition by looking at European painters of the 19th century and earlier. So that was the way she was introduced to art. Then she moved on to the Art Students League in New York. And she studied under a great American master, William Merritt Chase, who was very famous then and very popular. He was very dashing physically. He wore a top hat and spats and carried a cane and was a very theatrical presence, which was very potent to the young artists, particularly to the young women, because if he was the embodiment of art, then what was their place in the world? That was a question that they might ask themselves. So, and he was famous for, he was sort of a master, he was a virtuoso of painting, and he had learned a slashing brushstroke that was taught in Germany in the 1870s. And it was full of excitement and energy and vitality. So all those pictures that you know of him, of women lying in hammocks or beautiful garden scenes, it's full of that kind of vitality, but also but the images themselves are very static. So he was well received, a very distinguished artist. So let me show you that. If I can have the next slide, I'll show you the kind of painting he was doing. So this is called Still Life with Dead Fish. I'm sorry it's so dark, but you can see how he uses light, and this virtuoso strokes of white on the image, on the figure, to show where the light hits it. He was great at doing metallic shine, any kind of glint, and it was very composed, highly composed. So this is a very traditional 19th century way of looking at the world. And O'Keeffe was an extremely good student. She was a master of craft. She was a great draftsman. She was a great colorist. She had been taught how to prepare a canvas, underpainting, chiaroscuro, all those technical aspects of art. She had been taught and she had mastered. So could I have the next slide, please? This is a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, done in 1908. It's called Still Life with Rabbit, as you can imagine. It's won a prize that year at the Art Students League. And you can see whose influence she was painting under, working under. There is that glinting light hitting the metallic object. There's the wonderful presentation of different textures. There's the fur of the dead rabbit. You don't really see what the texture is of whatever the rabbit is lying on, but it's a very studied 19th century version of the artist's view of the world. So she painted that, and after that in 1908, several things happened. She went to Chicago and painted as a commercial artist for a while. She also became very ill. She got typhoid, and she came home to Virginia, and she gave up art altogether. She said, I just don't want to continue. It's not exactly clear why she gave up painting, but she really did completely. She said, I couldn't even stand the smell of turpentine. And it is my speculation that one reason she stopped was that she had gone as far as she felt that she could. She had painted like the master. She had done everything that she was expected to do. She had learned these techniques. She had learned the art of composition. She could do exactly what William Merritt Chase did. She could never be him. She could never be the man. And I felt that she felt as though she had come to the end of a road. But in 1915, she was living in Charlottesville, where her family had moved after leaving Wisconsin, which is where she had been born. So she was living with the family in Charlottesville, and one of her sisters, Anita, said to her, you must take classes, art classes, at summer school at the University of Virginia. And Georgia agreed. She thought, why not? So she took a class from a man called Alan Bement, and he had studied with a man called Arthur Wesley Dow, who was very important in a sphere that was different from the one that Georgia had been aware of. Now, when she was at the Art Students League, painting like William Merritt Chase, she had also been exposed to the radical contemporary work that was shown at the gallery of Arthur Stieglitz. He had a gallery called 291. It was down on Lower Fifth Avenue. And there he was showing new work by European artists like Rodin's watercolors, which are very soft and amorphous and nearly abstract. He showed Picasso, he showed Matisse. So he was a forerunner of the modernist movement. And O'Keeffe had seen those paintings, but she hadn't, and she'd been interested by them, but she couldn't find her way into them. So those were sort of radical modernist movements, glimmerings that were coming from Europe, but she still hadn't found her way into something that absorbed her, that she felt that she could connect to. So she left the art world, as I said, and she went down to Virginia. When she got to Virginia, she was exposed to a different kind of art. And Alan Beeman was teaching the theories of Arthur Wesley Dow, and he had looked in a different direction when he was studying art. He had looked towards Asia, towards the East. Well, it could be the West too, depending on which way you go. But he was looking at Japanese prints at a time when the other artists were looking at Rodin, the Blau Rider, and he was looking at art in a completely different way. And he was telling his students to do something that appealed enormously to O'Keeffe. One of his exercises, so remember, O'Keeffe had come from the Art Institute of Chicago, where she was put down, she was told to sit in front of an old master and to copy it. What Arthur Wesley Dow said instead was take a sheet of paper, use 2 lines, and divide the space in a beautiful way. So that approach was radically different, and it put all the agency, all the power into the hands of the artist. Instead of saying, you have to do it the way someone else has done it, it said, your way is your way. It's an absolutely acceptable way. It's the way. So she started thinking in those terms. And Beament, Alan Beament, I don't know how you pronounce his name, maybe it's Beament, introduced her to these ideas. And could I have the next slide and I'll show you. All right, this is a woodcut, or it might be a painting. He did woodcuts and paintings of this same image. And it's called Moon Over the Hill or something like that. So you can see he's doing something totally different from the European art, like the 19th century images of William Merritt Chase. This is simplified, it's nearly abstract, large flat masses, which those are ideas that he drew from Japanese prints, this very flat monochromatic approach, and this wonderful sense of emotional presence. And that was something else that Dow encouraged his students to do. He wanted them to paint the way they felt about a landscape, not simply to compose it according to the rules of composition, not simply to think about technique and what brushstroke to use, but to deliver their feelings about that landscape. What are the feelings this place evokes in you? And that was another thing that made O'Keeffe start feeling that she could paint again, that she could start to produce again. So that summer, 1915 in Charlottesville, Virginia, she began to teach. That year she became Beament's assistant in the class. She was obviously a masterful painter, and she was lively and energetic. And so he asked her to help teach. So she was teaching there that summer of 1915 at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And there she met, could I have the next slide, please? Arthur Mcmahon, who was wonderfully handsome, as you can see. And he was a young graduate student at Columbia University in New York in political science. He was lively, he was handsome, he was really smart, and he loved to hike. And he was introduced to Georgia by a mutual friend of theirs, also a teacher there, who also loved to hike. So they and some other people took walks in the mountains, long walks that sometimes they would take meals and take picnics. And they became very good friends. And his mother was a feminist. And so Arthur was full of ideas that O'Keeffe had not really considered before. One of them was feminism. I don't mean to suggest this was the first time she'd ever heard of it, but he was instrumental in bringing to her people and writers that she hadn't encountered before. So he was just a source of incredible vitality for her, both in his delight in the landscape, his delight in painting, in hiking, and also in these ideas. And he introduced her to philosophers and political writers that she had never met before. So she was sort of brought alive this summer in Charlottesville in 1915. Arthur Mcmahon was to become important to her in other ways too. So could I have the next slide, please? This is the first letter that O'Keeffe wrote to McMahon. He left in, I think it's September, and he went back to Columbia. Now, she had planned to go back to New York that year. She wanted to go back and start studying again. But one of her sisters had become ill. Her sister Anita had been in nursing school, and she had collapsed with a heart problem, and she'd had to come home. And it took her months to recover. And Georgia's mother said to Georgia, I don't think you should go back to New York. I don't think you'll be able to stand it. It's too much for you. It takes too much out of you. I don't want you to collapse like Anita. I think you should do something quieter in a quieter place. Now, it's hard to imagine 28-year-old Georgia obeying her mother. And I wouldn't say that obeying is exactly what she did, but she did listen to her mother. And instead of going back to New York that fall, she had agreed to teach art in a small women's Methodist college outside Columbia, South Carolina. So it could not have been further from the New York art world. She was in a landscape she'd never seen before, and she was with people she didn't know, and none of them were part of the currents of New York art, the New York art world that she'd been exposed to before in 1908 when she was going to see the shows that Alfred Stieglitz was putting on, or even at the summer school at the University of Virginia when she was teaching art with Alan Bennett. So all of a sudden she was isolated. She was in a new place, separate from everyone else. And whatever she was going to do, it had no connection to the people that she had been part of in terms of the art world. So Arthur McMahon leaves, and something happened with his trunk. And Georgia O'Keeffe wrote him this first letter, and she says, I'm very much disturbed about that box of yours. It was sent off by mistake without a bill of lading, and they had to telegraph around to find it. They found a box in Alexandria that they think is yours, so made out this bill for it and sent the box on from there. The name was very much twisted, but the initials were yours, so I hope it is right. And that was the first letter that was exchanged between them. She also said in the letter, made this comment saying something, I can't quote it exactly. She said something like, I know that I should wait to let you write to me. As a girl, you should make the first move. But I wanted to write you, so I did. So that was O'Keeffe herself, even though by then she'd been in the Southern culture, which is a place that had very strict rules about how women should behave. She'd been there since almost the turn of the century, but she was ready to break those rules and say to McMahon, I wanted to write you, so I did. So the two of them start writing, and they're wonderful letters. O'Keeffe is full of interest and curiosity, and her letters are quite abstract. She often writes about the weather and what it looks like, what it feels like, what the leaves are doing. At one point she holds a pine branch in her hand and runs with it. And she says, when you run holding a branch, it sounds like wind in the trees. So she's very attuned to the natural world around her, very aware of every aspect of the weather, how it affects the landscape, what the trees look like, what the birds sound like. She loved being outdoors. So she writes to Arthur, talks to him about the people she's seeing. She rarely uses names, so it's frustrating for a scholar. She'll say that the woman who teaches in the chemistry class, or the woman across the road who asked me for tea. She rarely tells us who she's dealing with, but she fills her letters with the details of her life. So you get a very vivid sense of what she's doing, not much about the teaching or about the girls, although she likes them, but she is full of energy and vitality. And the letters become more and more frequent. And as the weeks and months go by, as the fall starts in, she writes to her friend Anita Politzer, who is living in New York and whom she met studying at the Art Students League. She writes to Anita and says, Anita, I am on the verge of falling in love in a way that I never thought I would, like no one. And she said, it's frightening to me. I'm on the edge of something I've never experienced before. And clearly she is falling in love with Arthur. It's not clear that that happened before he left. It seems to happen at a distance. So remember this, O'Keeffe is separate, isolated from her world, isolated from the art world, and in touch with a man who's at a distance, whose mind she greatly admires, whose ideas she relishes, and whose company she enjoys. So in November, she writes Anita and says, Anita, if I told you he was coming here for Thanksgiving, could you believe it? And that's what happens. Arthur has to come down at Thanksgiving because he has to teach somewhere else afterwards in the South. And he makes the point of coming to Georgia for Thanksgiving. And she is in a state of extreme excitement and delight. And he arrives, and the two of them spend this wonderful vacation together. And she writes it to him beforehand, and she says, here's where we're going to go walking. I'll get the lunch lady to make us a lunch. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And it's all about walks. It's all about being outdoors. And then, could I have the next slide? This is a picture that Arthur took of the two of them that weekend, Thanksgiving weekend. And after I had finished the book and I turned it in, I had imagined that my publishing house, Harper & Row, would have some photographer person who would find all the photographs for me for the book. And I was informed that that was not the case, that it was my responsibility to get all the photographs. So I had to start on sort of a second book-like project. And I had no photograph of Arthur any time before 1957. And this was long before the internet. And so I was calling place after place. I called Columbia. They gave me a reference. And I finally called, I would call a place and I'd say, I'm looking for his son. Do you know where he is? And they'd say, you try here at another university. And I finally called, and a man answered the phone, and I said, I'm looking for Arthur Mcmahon's son. And he said, that's me. And I said, oh, here's who I am. I'm writing this book. I'm looking for photographs. Do you have any photographs of him sort of between 1915 and 1930 or sometime in that period? And he said, I have photographs that he took of himself and Georgia O'Keeffe Thanksgiving weekend of 1915. Would that interest you? So it was so exciting to hear that. And I flew down, and he gave me these photographs to use. And so this is a picture of the two of them. And you can see Arthur is looking off to the side because he set this up himself. He was an amateur photographer. So he's tugging on a string to snap the shutter to take the photograph. So you can see the two of them are out in nature. They are incredibly happy. Georgia is beaming. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is a picture taken that same weekend of Georgia by Arthur. And in it, she looks at the photography. There is a photography person at Harper & Row. And when he and I were looking at these pictures, he called that Georgia's "Come Kiss Me" photograph. So the two of them have this ecstatically happy idyll during Thanksgiving weekend, 1915. I want you to remember that moment. And she writes to Anita and says, I'm the happiest person in the world. He's come and left. It was the best moment in my life. So that's Thanksgiving weekend. So then December 1st starts. And during that month, Georgia O'Keeffe is still working in South Carolina. She's teaching at this college. And then everyone goes home on vacation. She decides not to go home on vacation. Instead, she stays at school to work. And the teachers at school like her. She's a friendly, warm person, and everyone likes her. And they understand that she does her own work. It's not related to anybody else. So she takes over her studio, spreads her old work out on the floor, looks at it all, and says to herself, this is derivative. I know who I was painting with when I painted that. This is like so-and-so. I know who I was painting with when I painted that. And by her account, she throws everything away. And she gets out her drawing paper. And in this state of distance and blissful happiness, a state of love, I don't have any reason to think their relationship was a physical one, that it was consummated, and it probably wasn't, but she certainly was in love with him. She talked about kissing him. So there she is in this state of tremendous excitement, emotional excitement, about a man who is hundreds of miles away from her, that she has no way of seeing for months. And what she does is channels her energy, these energies. And remember, she has been now studying art and mastering the techniques of art for 15 years. She is a master of technique, and she is ready to put down her own ideas, completely hers, on the page. Can I have the next slide, please? So she does, during this period of December, late December 1915, she creates the works that declare Georgia O'Keeffe as her own artist, her own voice, a completely different and unique artist from one we have seen before. Could I have the next slide, please? This is special number 12, I think, or 13, 1915. It's one of my favorite pictures. You can see how beautifully executed it is. You can see the subtlety of the charcoal, how it's darker, deeply dark in some places where it's almost translucent in others. The delicacy of the line, that jagged line, which we'll see again in her, well, I'm not giving that talk tonight. You will see this again in her work as you go through her career. These tender, rounded, bud-like forms. There's a wonderful quote by the poet Gaston Bachelard who says, "Everything round invites a caress." And that's what O'Keeffe is doing. She creates forms that invite us to have an emotional response to them. And that's what she's doing in these drawings. She's asking us for an emotional response, even though they are abstract. And that's one of the things O'Keeffe does so brilliantly. She uses abstract forms to evoke some kind of emotional response in us. That fluid, current-like, that part of it on the right hand part of the page, I guess I can't, can I use my cursor? Does that work? Anyway, it looks like a river, and she uses the idea of fluidity and water and the feeling of motion, liquid motion. She uses that over and over again. Thank you. Throughout her career. So those forms will reappear. They also draw on the natural world. We can't exactly explain where we've seen them before, but we know that they exist in the natural world. They're ones that we already have connotations for. We have already made connections to those images. So these pictures, they're charcoal drawings, and they're big. They're 24 by 18, something like that. She does them in sort of a white heat of emotion. She is really transformed right here in this passage. So she does the pictures, and then to get rid of them, and she did this often, she wanted to get rid of the pictures that she'd done. She rolled them into a tube, and she sent them off to her friend Anita Politzer in New York. And she said, here are the pictures I've done. And Anita Politzer, who also had studied art with O'Keeffe and had gone to Stieglitz's gallery, takes them down without asking Georgia, takes them down to Alfred Stieglitz, sorry, at his gallery, and she sees him alone. And this is the famous description of the scene. She says, I have some images, some pictures I'd like to show you. And he says, bring them into the back room. And in the back room, she spreads them out on the table. And Alfred Stieglitz looks at them and he says, at last, a woman on paper. So this is the sequence that happens. O'Keeffe returning to art, discovering a way of looking at art and painting that she had never seen before, she'd never been introduced to before, allowing those ideas to sort of percolate in her mind, listening to Arthur, falling in love with Arthur, hiking in with Arthur, walking through the landscape, moving to a new place, moving to a new landscape, losing Arthur, Arthur coming to visit, and then reaching this peak of activity and emotional excitement, culminating in this set of fabulous drawings that declare Georgia O'Keeffe as the author that we now know. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the man who was looking at those drawings. This is Alfred Stieglitz. He was 24 years older than she was. He was her mother's age. He was married. He was a photographer himself, so he was an artist. He was also a dealer, a gallery owner, and he sold both photographs. He exhibited both photographs and paintings. And he also had started a magazine called Camera Works, which started out just showing photography, but later showed all sorts of artists, all sorts of visual artists, and became kind of a central place for people who wrote about art, who considered art. It had very beautiful images in it. And O'Keeffe began receiving it. I forget if she subscribed to it or not, but it was a very important part of contemporary American art. So he was a central figure for anyone who was painting in America, in New York, in the New York Circle. O'Keeffe had gone there, and she had gone there as a student in 1908, and she remembered going there with other students from the Art Students League. And she said, somebody said, okay, let's all go over to 291 and get Stieglitz talking, because he was very intense, very voluble, and anyone could get into an argument with him. He loved arguing. You can see that in his eyes. So he would, you'd say something to him like, modern art is better than 19th century art, and he would disagree with you. He would disagree with anything. He loved new ideas, he loved students, but he was also very firm in his own beliefs. So he was kind of a whirlpool, setting up these currents. He was very eccentric. One of my favorite images, which is in my biography, is of one of the installations of an exhibition at his gallery. And I believe I was the first person to notice this. I had never seen it in any of the other literature, but in the show was an African mask and a piece of sculpture by Brancusi. And then on a pedestal in the middle of the room, there's another object, which it took me a moment to recognize as a wasp's nest. And I had never seen anyone mention that or anyone recognize what it was. But Stieglitz wanted to challenge the viewer. He wanted to challenge the audience. He wanted to challenge your eye. He also loved it when people got it, when people said, this is beautiful. How could I not have seen it before? He loved introducing people to the ideas that he was presenting. So he was a real firestorm in the art world. So O'Keeffe had gone there to his gallery and seen the work that he was showing. She knew who he was. She knew about camera work. She knew everything about him, but she had never met him person to person in a way that would make him remember her. She had been there as a student in a group of students watching him. He had never focused on Georgia. So the way he first met her was on the page, was through those drawings. And you can see that he took her very seriously. And he wrote to her. In response to these paintings. I guess she first wrote to him, and she said, Anita told me that she brought you the drawings. I'd like to know what you thought of them. And he answered her with a wonderful response. And he was an incredible letter writer. He wrote pages and pages, and it's a scholar's joy, all of his letters to her, and all the letters in the Stieglitz Circle are at the Beinecke Library at Yale. So you can read these reams and reams of exchanges between all the people in that circle. So Stieglitz started writing to O'Keeffe, and their letters are quite wonderful, very intense, lots about art and feeling. And he too, like O'Keeffe, he describes the landscape, the weather, the feelings of it. So they become closer and closer during this spring of 1916. She's still writing to Mcmahon. He is still the man she's in love with. And that spring she comes back to New York to finish some classes that she needs because she's about to go out to Texas, which is also going to transform her art. She sees Arthur because he's still there at Columbia. But she also sees Stieglitz. And although she keeps on writing to Arthur, somebody asked me this at a recent event, nothing happens particularly in their relationship, but it just peters out because he is never going to come to Texas where she is. He is never going to be as involved with art and the landscape the way she is. And so although they keep writing and they stay warmly attached to each other, their love affair, however it was manifested, finally it sort of fades away. But Stieglitz, you see this face, this intensity. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe stay close and they write to each other. When she comes back, she sees him as well. And then she goes to Texas, where she is teaching at Canyon, which is in the Panhandle. It's near Amarillo. And she had taught at Amarillo a few years earlier, and she loved the landscape of Texas. So could I have the next slide, please? So in Texas, she starts doing something else that is completely different. This is called Light Coming Onto the Plains. She was one of the greatest watercolorists we have ever seen, watercolorists we have ever seen. She comes as close as you can to painting with light. The mastery of the form here is dazzling. The sense of radiance, the sense of luminosity, the delicacy. And again, she paints something that we all recognize, although it's not a conventional image of a sunrise, but we know what it is. Now she was transformed again by the openness of this landscape, the presence of the sky. She does pictures of stars in the dark sky. She does pictures of sunset and sunrise. She does pictures of the plains. And again, she's far away. She's writing to Stieglitz, who becomes more and more important to her. She's also writing to Arthur, telling them both about the radiance that she's looking at, the excitement that she's in. She's separate from the art world. She's a million miles away. She's in the Panhandle of Texas, and she's creating images that have never been made before. Could I have the next image? So she also became influenced by Paul Strand, who's a photographer, a young photographer, part of Stieglitz's stable, and he was doing something radical as well. This is called bowls, and what Strand was doing was using the lens to magnify and crop images in a way that photographers hadn't done before. Photographers before this period had used the camera like a painter. They had composed images, they had manipulated them sometimes, but it was photographs really looked like paintings until Strand came along and said, there's a technical mastery that I can use here that will make photographs different from paintings. So he used the lens to magnify and crop images to make them into abstract compositions in a way that was really new. And O'Keeffe saw this. She was very attracted to Strand, and they had a kind of a little electric moment. And she saw these images and she was blown away by them. And she wrote to Anita and said, I'm a little in love with Paul Strand and his photographs. And I've been making Strand images all day. So what Strand is doing, as you can see, is using objects, and he's taking away the presence that we know. It's hard to recognize these as bowls. It takes you a minute to figure out where the concavity is, what the shape of them is. He's asking you, he's challenging you to see them as simply an abstract composition. So what O'Keeffe did, and one of the interesting things about O'Keeffe is you never see her as part of a school. She's not, her paintings don't look like John Marin or Charles Demuth or Marsden Hartley's. They look like hers. And although she takes these ideas from Paul Strand, the pictures that she does from them look nothing like Paul Strand's. And by 1918, she was still in Texas. She became ill during the pandemic. It may have been the flu. She left canyon and moved to a place in Waring, Texas, where she recovered. And then Paul Strand was sent by Alfred Stieglitz, who by then was deeply in love with her. And so is Paul Strand. So Paul Strand went down to represent both himself and Stieglitz and brought her back to New York. And in New York, she had to choose between the two men, and she chose Stieglitz. She moved into an apartment owned by one of his family members, and she basically spent the rest of her life with him in one way or another. So in 1919, could I have the next slide, please? She paints this. Now, we all know O'Keeffe painted flower pictures, but I want you to understand how radical her flower images were at that time. This is a small picture. It looks huge here. I don't have the size, but it's not a very large picture. But what she's doing is using that same idea that Paul Strand gave us, which is cropping and magnifying the image and making it abstract. We understand that it's a flower, but it's not a flower that we've ever seen before. And all the flower painters before O'Keeffe painted the flower at a respectful distance, the way you would put a flower on the table and set up your easel next to it. And you saw it at that human distance. What O'Keeffe is doing, what Paul Strand did, is leaning in the way the lens allows you to do, without that awkwardness that you would feel if you leaned in close to somebody or some object and put your nose right next to it. But the camera allows you to do that. And Georgia took that idea and magnified her images and cropped them. But when Strand drained his images of emotion, she infused them with emotion. So her images of flowers, of apples, of fruits, of bones, of hills are filled with the emotion that those images evoked in her. So again, she is transforming her art into something that had not been presented before. And there we are. That's all I have to say about this, and I would welcome your questions. Thank you again, Kent Library, House of Books.
Thank you so much, Roxana. Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. I see that some are gathering here. I'm gonna just sort of seize my moment to ask you a question, Roxana, because you mentioned something that seems always of interest to me, which is that O'Keeffe was there. There are some artists, whether they're writers or painters or whatever, who seem to sort of thrive in the hub of things, and then there are others who seem like they need to sort of go off to the farthest reaches of Texas, like O'Keeffe did ultimately, to sort of really sort of see something that nobody else can see. What is in your mind the difference between those two kinds of people? Like, is there anything that, I don't know, it's an open-ended question.
So it's a really good question, and it's very evident that she went away from the cities in order to do the work that we all know her for. She did paint in the winters in New York City. She painted those wonderful still lifes, and she was part of the circle that Stieglitz had created, and she listened. But one of the things she said, and most writers I know, for example, know this: if you talk too much, if you talk about your work, you are giving up the energy that should go into the work. And she said at one point, everybody's talking and talking and talking, and I just don't want to listen to it anymore. And even when she went to Santa Fe and Taos, she became plunged into a circle of people that were around Mabel Dodge Luhan. And Mabel was a wonderful hostess, and she invited lots of people. D.H. Lawrence was there, and John Marin came, and all sorts of celebrities. And O'Keeffe had to learn to wean herself away from that. It was fun. The first summer she went with Beck Strand, and they had a wonderful time. And dinner every night was a party, and people drank too much and danced. But she said, I have to keep myself away from that. I cannot go to these parties every night. So even there, where we think of as being remote, there was this sense of intellectual activity and too much energy put into parties and talking. And she had to remove herself from that. So she has that reputation of being very aloof and standoffish. She had close friends in New Mexico, but she did not allow herself to be drawn into the whirlwind in which people are talking more than they are working.
Interesting. Very interesting. Once again, please put your questions as you have them into the chat or the Q&A. One question here. Somebody wondering about Georgia O'Keeffe's family life, and in particular how she kept from having children. There seems to be perhaps there's some debate around what her thoughts on that or what people think. But what are your thoughts on what may have kept her from having children?
Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of evidence. You don't have to speculate. And can I say by the book, all that is discussed in the book. She was very clear. She wanted children. Stieglitz didn't. And she says in the letters in this new edition, she writes to Arthur Mcmahon, she says she wants to have a child with him, actually. So it's not really a matter of speculation. She wanted children. Stieglitz was very determined that she not have children. I don't know exactly what the technique was, but that they used, but he absolutely refused to have a child with her, partly because he thought that she would give up too much of her time and energy to a child. But partly because he had one daughter whom he loved and was not very close to, which devastated him. And she had a child, and after her childbirth, she lapsed into what was then called delirium. Anyway, postpartum depression, from which she never emerged. She was institutionalized and never returned to normal life. And his favorite sister, had died in childbirth. So for Stieglitz, the idea of childbirth was terrifying. And he had this dual reason for wanting her never to have children. One, he thought she would die. And two, he thought she would stop painting. So it was he who prevented that.
Interesting. Another question here about the subjects of her paintings. Why did she paint so few people?
Well, if you look at, it's a good question. If you look at her paintings, you can see that what she wants to do is, what she chooses are images that are semi-abstract, that are kind of dreamlike, and that are very still. So it's really counter to the idea of a human. She rarely painted anything that was alive. There are no antelopes in her pictures, bones and antlers, but not living creatures. And I think it's because, I mean, for me, it seems that what she wants is something that's essential and still and kind of primeval, not something that's quick and alive and moving and changing all the time. She wants the essence.
I want to. I'm always kind of. I know you didn't. I know you wanted to keep the eye out of the book, but I'm sort of curious about your approach as a writer to a subject matter like this versus how you approach the fiction that she writes, because of course you've written many novels and many short story collections. What's the difference between diving into a novel where perhaps you are playing with some historical detail and some historical fact versus diving into a biography?
In most novels, you're not dealing with any historical fact. You're creating fiction. It is fiction. And with a biography, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, it's your task as a biographer never to alter anything and to put down only information that you can support and that has been thoroughly investigated. So they're completely different in terms of the facts you use in the story that you tell. And I felt absolutely obliged to make this into a scholarly document that could be relied on by other scholars. As to the writing of it, as a novelist, it was a great pleasure to be given such a wonderful set of characters and such a wonderful story. And I enjoyed telling the story as I would like a novelist. But as to playing with facts, never.
How much do you feel like you're using the tools of the novelist though in creating, in writing a biography like this?
I absolutely know that I was doing, I mean, I described each landscape that she painted in or that she lived in. And that's what a novelist, it's my job as a novelist to create a landscape like O'Keeffe, to create a landscape that gives you a sense of an emotional presence of it so that you can feel what it's like to stand on the plains in Amarillo. You can feel what it's like to watch the sun come up over the mesa in Santa Fe in New Mexico. So that's my job, to give you a vivid sense of place and also these characters. And it's a great pleasure as a novelist to write about characters that have so much complexity and richness.
And it's our pleasure to read as well. So thank you so very much, Roxana, for joining us this evening to talk about the reissue of this wonderful biography. And thank you to the Kent Memorial Library. Thank you to Lucy. Thank you to Amanda Myers. Thank yous all around. And once again, please, if you'd like a copy of Georgia O'Keeffe, you can purchase one signed at houseofbooksct.com/O'Keeffe. Roxana, thank you so much. Seriously, such a pleasure to have you here this evening. Here, wherever here is in the virtual landscape, we are all in our own little places. But I'm so glad that we were able to present you. And thank you so much for everyone coming tonight.
Thanks to all of you for coming, and thank you, Ben and Lucy, again. This is a delight. It's a real pleasure for me.
Thank you so much. Take care. Stay safe.